Okay, thanks. So I have my one audience member and maybe somebody will listen on recording. So I guess I'll retrack what I did a little bit. My two co-authors and I were all kind of blue collar kids, and I was raised in Baltimore, an inner suburb of Baltimore, did a lot of blue collar work in the city for years. And it struck me that folks in the city, at least Black folks, kind of like my Sicilian grandparents, were outside of the rule of law. Police didn't really protect them. And that was a huge issue and actually caused a lot of middle class Black community in Baltimore, people who were in Baltimore since before the Great Migration, to move to the suburbs because police protection was better, which in an ideal world, people should not have to move to get protected by law enforcement. And so I always found this a fascinating and intractable problem. About 300 people a year, nearly all young Black males, were killed in the early 70s when I was working in Baltimore. And that's still the case today. And people like me thought that that was probably just a fact of life. We couldn't do much about it. And then in the mid 90s, New York City had this remarkable success. They went from being perhaps one of the most dangerous cities in the country, to being one of the safest in just a few years. And the big changes were in a 2-year period. But New York City, by the 2000s, the mid 2000s, had a homicide rate, and I focus on homicide because we can count it. We're very bad at counting crimes, but we're good at counting homicide rates. Police don't generally hide the victims. Homicide rates and car thefts are the two numbers that we're most secure of, the second because of insurance reports. And so I said, well, this is fascinating. How do they do this? So I started looking at it, and I also started looking at what researchers were looking at. And we did this 2 years in 2016. I think 16 we did it. We redid it in 2020. We looked at what are the articles of Black Lives Matter that are widely cited. And we found that they generally focus on social media and activism, racial activism, white attitudes, immigration and migrants, public health, a range of other topics. Very few, when we list them in our PowerPoint, which I can make available, and I can make the paper available, very few look at things that are likely to actually save Black lives. The only exception, the 19th most cited work in the last few years, preventing the use of deadly force, the relationship between police agency policies and rates of officer-involved gun deaths. A great paper. People should read it. It essentially says that if you just have police do paperwork before drawing their guns, not firing, which everybody does, but before drawing them, this seems to encourage police to try other means of solving disputes. And it does lead to a substantial decrease in police shootings of civilians without any increase in officer fatalities. So this is a paper I would urge people to read, Public Administration Review 2017, Preventing the Use of Deadly Force, the Relationship Between Police Agency Policies and Rates of Officer-Involved Gun Deaths. But the other 24, 25 papers we looked at didn't really have anything directly to do with things likely to save Black lives. And we thought this is not good in a lot of ways. We think some of it is maybe people haven't lived or worked in areas where violence is a real issue, and police violence is certainly an issue, but a much bigger issue arguably is homicide, which in Black communities is much more serious than in white communities. One thing I think I would argue we should really look at facts, and there are verifiable facts in this we can look at that nobody looks at much. In a given year, but 1 in 669, we crunched the numbers for 2015, but it seems about the same now. 1 in 669 police killed someone in the line of duty in 2015. At the same time, it's actually pretty rare for police to kill people. And it's also unclear whether police disproportionately shoot African-Americans once you control for behavior. Roland Fryer virtually got fired for doing the paper on that, but that does seem to be what the empirical facts tell us. At the same time, about half of homicide victims and perpetrators are Black, as about a quarter of those killed by cops are Black. Last year, as I recall, there were 8 unarmed African Americans killed by police, but almost 8,000 homicides of Black folks. Another fact we need to look at: the Minneapolis officer who murdered George Floyd had 18 prior citizen complaints and had been involved in 3 shooting incidents. The vast majority of police go through their whole careers and are never involved in a shooting incident. This guy was involved in 3. In a well-run police department, he would have been possibly fired, possibly in the motor pool. New York City has a large number of police that are not allowed to carry guns. They're working in the motor vehicle division and things like that. The department found it too difficult to fire them, but one was able to take their guns away. Minneapolis didn't do that. In fact, Minneapolis actually had that officer training rookies on the day when he murdered George Floyd. That's an outrage, and it gets very little media attention. And the Minneapolis police have not been reformed in terms of their personnel policies. Third thing we would say is lessons from the 90s in reinventing government. Some organizations work a lot better than others. We can improve by copying the better run organizations. And we also feel like Patrick and I have a background in personnel, studying personnel policy. Personnel policy is key. Who you recruit, who you hire, how you train them, and who you fire or at least take their guns away is really key to improving policing or anything else. And always has been. My dad was a postal manager back in the 60s and 70s. Back then it was key. It still is. The military knows this. Better run civilian organizations know this. Better run school systems know this. So we look at NYPD, where, as I point out, New York City's killings, police killings of civilians went from 90 to 100 a half century ago to about 10 annually now. That's about 75% below the national mean, which is very good. 1993 to 2014, homicides fell in New York City from 1,950 to 328. They increased a little bit since. But New York City still remains a relatively safe city. And not only that, but since 2011, there's a 98% reduction in stop and frisk. And I'm fond of pointing out, people say it's mass incarceration. Incarceration in New York City fell from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. It went down. It didn't go up. Franklin Simmering's book, The City That Became Safe, has all the numbers on that. People say, oh, it's mass incarceration. Look at the actual numbers. That's not it. So Patrick and I did a back of the envelope calculation. We argued if NYPD was run the way it was in 1990, we did this calculation back in 2012. At that point, it appeared that there were over 25,000 more people would have died had the system not, had the police department in New York not reformed. Mostly people of color, overwhelmingly people of color. That 25,000 would be a lot higher today. This is huge. People should be writing about this. So why? So it wasn't mass incarceration. Instead, it seems to be, nobody can say for sure if there was one exact thing, it seems to be a set of changes, tactical changes, that were enabled by better management of police human capital. The key thing we argue, one was nationally they started recruiting. They started recruiting outside New York, so they had a better mix of officers, arguably. But a huge thing was precinct commanders were held accountable. William Bratton, when he was police chief in the mid-90s, terminated, forced into early retirement, roughly 2/3 of precinct commanders, and replaced them with other folks. I had a discussion of this with John Timoney before he died. He was the deputy chief under Bratton and then became police chief in Philadelphia and Miami. He was telling me that in New York City, 37,000 police officers at the time, there were roughly 400 people that he could force into early retirement or out and out fire. And any NYPD cop, he could take their gun away after a process. But he said there were 400 people he could essentially fire in New York. In Philadelphia, there were 2. He could never really reform the Philadelphia Police Department. He had some success. Homicides went down 20%, but he could never have the kind of success he had in New York, despite support from the mayor, because they could never get the legal changes to give him, they could never beat the unions on this to fight the power, to be able to really manage cops by firing them, including high-level cops. You have to enable police commissioners to hold precinct commanders accountable. So we argue, okay, look, this tells us some lessons. We're studying what seems to be now one of the best departments, if not the best department in the country. Others aren't. So we argue, how can we make this a national issue? We argue that what doesn't get measured doesn't count, right? As the Clinton administration people used to say. So it was homicide. Poverty makes the job of law enforcement harder. Huge correlations among the largest cities in the country between homicide and poverty. No surprise there. Fairly large correlation, although not that big, between police shootings of civilians and homicide. So we said, let's rank police departments. So we did the initial version of this. It was published in Public Integrity in 2000, only looking at 21 cities because we used incomplete data. We've updated it now. We have the 50 largest cities in the country. And we basically developed our own index. We have the name of the city, we have the population, we have the percent poverty rate in the city. We have total homicides for the year 2020. We have, I'm sorry, 2019, we have the year 2019 for homicide. Most of our numbers are from 20. But homicides don't jump around much from year to year generally. We have the percentage of Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians, although we didn't really use that in these analyses. We have the percentage of minority, we didn't really use that. We have the total police recorded civilian deaths over a 5-year period, actually over a 7-year period, because thankfully police actually shoot very few people. A lot of people die from homicides. Very few are killed by police, as I've said. And from that, we developed the Police Performance Index. And so which we can send anybody. And we basically compare cities, and we have a list of 50 cities, but let's look at the top 10: New York, Boston, San Diego, Raleigh, Mesa, of the 50 largest cities in the country, Virginia Beach, Austin, El Paso, San Jose. One thing interesting is San Francisco. One thing interesting is some are surprises. If you read the right-wing media, at least, you'd think San Francisco is a hellhole. It isn't. You would think that things along the border are terrible. They're not. El Paso does great, always has. These vary a lot on poverty rates. New York has a fairly high poverty rate. El Paso is a very high poverty rate, but most of the other cities that perform well do have low poverty rates. Mesa, not so much. We look at the 10 lowest. Washington, D.C., Denver, surprise, Atlanta, Louisville, Tulsa, Miami, Albuquerque, Las Vegas, Kansas City, and the worst is Baltimore. And when I talk to people who study policing and I ask them, what do you think is the best police department in the country? A lot of times they'll just say, oh, it's probably New York. They're right. When I ask them what the worst police city in the country, a lot of them come up with Baltimore, my hometown. And both in 15 and 20, our leader was NYPD. The worst in the country is Baltimore. Baltimore does have a high poverty rate, but there were about 13 cities I recall with higher poverty rates than Baltimore that have better policing, way better policing. Baltimore's homicide rate is around 6 times the national average. It's actually the highest on the list. Baltimore police killings of civilians is higher than average, but not that much higher. I mean, honestly, police could do nothing and the homicide rate could be really high, and maybe they don't do much in Baltimore. We need to study why that is. What we really want to do, though, is make this a public issue. We want people to start comparing their police departments with other police departments and where your department is not doing well. We want people to not reelect the mayor over it. We want people to pressure the state legislature to make it possible, to make it easier to fire precinct commanders who often have civil service protections. We want to put pressure on mayors to seriously negotiate police union contracts, and for that matter, teacher union contracts, and make it easier to terminate people who aren't working out. Or at the very least, and they generally have this power now, to do what New York City does, to have a very good internal affairs unit. And when police are having issues, take away their license to hold a gun, put them in the motor pool, give them clerical duties. Don't have them out on the streets with weapons, which for police is a real humiliation to do that. But the key thing seems to be the ability to fire precinct commanders. New York City NYPD became a learning organization. It happened essentially in 3 years. And I would argue through 2 key mechanisms. One is weekly CompStat meetings where the leaders of the department would be meeting with every precinct commander, all 70 of them, and going over the real-time crime rates and talking about other precincts that had done well and asking why they weren't copying them. But that wouldn't have been effective if Bratton couldn't fire precinct commanders, which he could. He forced NYPD to become a learning organization, and in just a couple of years, he changed the culture. So I think we need to have public conversations about this. We need to, by the way, we've also done number crunching on, are there relationships between the numbers of cops per capita and how effective the department is? There aren't. There don't seem to be. When we compare the top 10 and bottom 10 cities, there aren't. And when we just look at correlations, cities with more cops tend to do a little worse on our rankings. So I'm sure there's some threshold number. You need some minimum number of cops to be effective, but probably like teachers and class size, it doesn't seem to have much impact on whether things work. I think probably teacher quality and police quality matters a lot more. We need to study whether police are part of the governing coalition, whether leadership is even able to change. In Philadelphia, they very much are. You can't really get anything done without the police union, or at least it's very hard. In New York, not so much, or at least in the 90s, that became less true, and it enabled people to make these changes, some even earlier than the 90s. The ability to fire precinct commanders actually came from 1983. The first Black commissioner of NYPD felt the department was run by Irish people, which it sort of was. And he was able quietly to introduce that reform to enable him to fire precinct commanders. He really left before he was able to use it, and nobody but Bratton really used it to fight crime. But if you can get that as part of the powers given your police commissioners, then police commissioners can hold people under them accountable, and we can realistically hold police commissioners and mayors accountable. We need to have public discussions about this. So what this really is about is trying to get academics and media and others to have public discussions about why some police departments work better than others and how we can make this a thing. And you know, until we do that, we're not really going to be able to make Black Lives Matter. And bad policing doesn't really affect whites. It doesn't really affect middle-class Blacks. One thing really interesting that's happened in the last 35 years, William Julius Wilson crunches the numbers on this, is back in 1970, if you were Black, whether you were poor or rich, you were fairly likely to be a victim of homicide. In the last 50 years, there's been a remarkable turnaround. Middle and upper class African Americans are almost as safe as white folks. Low-income African Americans are facing more than 60% more danger than they ever have, at least since we started measuring these things. They're not given police protection. I honestly think, I hate to say it, but Sister Souljah was kind of right. If more, she said white folks, I would say middle class white and Black folks were being affected by bad policing, we would be more likely to have sensible policing policies. Because they're not, we don't have serious discussions about what it would take to make police more effective and to bring poor Black folks in particular under the protection of the rule of law, and more confident that their police won't victimize them and that street crime won't victimize them. And when that happens, they'll cooperate more with police. It'll be more like New York and less like Baltimore, where the perception of people, which is not always wrong, is that it is dangerous to cooperate with the police because the people who victimized you will find out and they will get revenge. So I will leave it at that. Baltimore is kind of like Sicily, where my grandparents left in some respects. And I hope in my lifetime that changes, but I'm not entirely optimistic that it will. So I seem to have erased your screen from my screen. Let me see if there's anything in the chat, or see, how can I restore the screen where I can see people? There's nothing in the chat. See if there's anything. There's nothing in Q&A. Participants. We have a few participants. Not really. Anybody have any thoughts or questions? Feel free to pipe in.
Oh, I have a couple questions.
Yeah, please do. I'm trying to restore the thing so I can see you. I can't, but I can hear you at least. Go ahead. I can't hear you. Are you speaking?
Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you. Okay.
My name is Ivan. I'm a law student at Arizona State University.
I'm sorry, where are you?
Arizona State University.
Winona State?
Arizona State.
Arizona State. Oh, excellent. Excellent.
Do you think that the turnaround in homicides of people of color is, because you said it has gone down in the last 50 years, do you think it's because of the technology, social media, people having more cameras?
I think one thing we need to look at more is national homicide rates. We really just compare cities, nationally, homicide went down. I kind of buy into the general view that some of that was better policing. A lot of it was demographic changes, in particular, fewer young people in the last 20 years at least. It's gone up a lot the last 6 years, but people point out correctly that the situation still isn't nearly as bad as it was in the late 80s. I mean, in Baltimore, it's never changed, but in most cities in the country as a whole, it's not as bad as it was in the late 80s and early 90s. But I would say better policing and demographic changes. But what I find really interesting is the change in New York City dwarfed all of those. And it came before demographic changes that nationally, I think, had some positive impacts on crime. And it was a miraculous change. When you cut homicide in 50% in 26 months, that's impossible, right? But they did it. They weren't faking the numbers. That was real. How the heck did they do it? That should really interest people. And how did they keep it down and actually keep making improvements after that, while decreasing officer brutality, at least as near as we can measure it? I mean, I find, why don't we study success? Success is a remarkable thing. Let me see if I can, I'm trying to figure out how to bring people's pictures back. And Patrick, do you have anything to add?
So, Bob, if you want to bring in the thumbnails of the other participants, you see in the one little screen, you see like a flat line and then like a box and then a double box.
Yeah.
And so click on the double box.
Okay.
Click, and you should see everybody.
I've got, I see the names. I didn't see let me try it again. Yeah, I can see let me stopping screen sharing.
Yeah, stop screen sharing, then you'll definitely.
Yeah. Which means I have to get back to screen share. I'll figure it out in a minute.
It should be at the bottom of your screen.
Okay, I've got it. Stop share. All right, got it. Okay, I can see people now. Yay. So
I'll just add on the technology question. I think in the long term, the widespread availability of police body cameras is going to reduce unjustified civilian shootings by police. I think it takes a while, though, for people to change their behaviors. So I think at this point, the police behaviors haven't caught up with the fact that everything they say and do is being recorded if they have a body cam on. And there's some recent cases of police who knew they had body cameras on committing just horrifically violent and unjustifiable assaults on civilians. So I think that's indicative of the fact that it takes a while to change the behaviors of folks.
But I would add two other things. Police brutality is probably quite common. We don't really know how common, right? Police killings of civilians are quite rare. And the like I said, last year, I think, as I recall, police killed 8 unarmed white folks and 6 unarmed black folks. This is almost 700,000 cops. It's quite rare, and it's usually justified. Some of those people were attacking, and we focus a lot on bizarre things that are photographed. I think the bizarre things are rare. That said, I do think we could dramatically reduce police killings of civilians. Zimring's excellent book, When Police Kill, points out there's about 1,000 people a year killed by cops. That's been really stable. As opposed to Great Britain had 2 last. I looked at 4 years back. Great Britain had 2. We had about 1,000. Canada had about 30. But Americans are more violent. American police face more violence. We have a lot more guns. Those those 1,000 killings by police, Zimring argues that with better training, with more ability to hold police accountable, we could perhaps bring that down to 200. There's a huge category of shootings that are lawful but awful. Given the way police were trained, given the equipment they had, it was a justifiable shooting, but it perhaps could have been avoided. Zimring argues it could be as many as 800. I would suspect he's right. I've seen other analyses that are similar. That would still leave us with 200. I think we can make improvements. We can clearly make improvements, but this is going to pale before, you know, the last year, I think 19,000 people dead of homicide, 8,000 African-Americans dead of homicide. So if we just look at that side of the equation, and I think for sure we should look at that side of the equation, we're going to miss a lot.
I have a question. When looking at all of these numbers and studying police departments, especially like Baltimore, how does defunding police departments factor into the work that you do, and thinking through, if we defund the police, how do we allocate those funds into better like mental health treatment responses, things like that? Like how does your work factor around defunding the police essentially?
Patrick and I have done almost nothing on that. Wilfred has done a lot of it, and it's a shame he's not here, but what he's done mostly is just raw number crunching, not really theory guided. He makes a case that defunding the police, having fewer police and having them patrol less aggressively has been associated in a number of cities, and he mostly looks at Chicago as hometown, with very substantial increases in homicides without really changing the number of people killed by police, which is pretty stable. I think intuitively that makes sense. We probably should do work on that. We haven't done much. Wilfred has done some, but I think we need to bring his analysis more systematically into our analysis. I see this as a case where the political system is working kind of the way it's supposed to work. Police in cities like Minneapolis and Chicago and New York and Los Angeles, people are demanding defunding of police. We started going down that road. Police forces were cut back a little bit, special tactics units in particular, which maybe should have been cut back. And crime went up. After crime went up, Seattle, for example, Seattle actually elected a Republican prosecutor supported by the Democratic governor. That hasn't happened in half century, I think. Crime went up, and now local officials are rethinking it, and they're starting to put more resources into policing again. I am not convinced defunding police is the answer. I think, but you know, by the time we figure this out as social scientists, most social scientists kind of want to defund the police. We want to think it's the answer. I don't see much evidence it is. And I think the political class is going to by and large ignore us on this. And they will sort of go on street knowledge. And the street knowledge now is defunding the police has not worked out. And that was partly why Eric Adams got elected in New York, despite efforts by the previous mayor to have him not elected. He sort of went in a very different direction, pushing us back more to the Bloomberg days. Although without stop and frisk, I think they've shown you can keep New York safe without stop and frisk, which is humiliating for people. So I see this as more of, I honestly feel like social scientists were so guided by what we want to believe, and we're also so slow that I'm not sure we're going to be able to guide this. I think it'll be more politicians on the ground reacting to events on the ground in ways that their electorates reward or punish. Something I find really interesting, Harvard has a center for defunding the police, but Harvard has not defunded their own campus police. Which is interesting, right? The University of Chicago I know this because my daughter applied, is a huge campus police department because they're not willing to suffer the normal Chicago police, right? And when a UC student gets shot, which has happened 3 times in the last 2 years, it gets national headlines. When 10 people a weekend get killed in Chicago, which happens sometimes, it does not get national headlines. I think we up middle and upper class people are looking at this very differently than we would if our lives were on the line, and so are our institutions. And I think that's kind of a shame. I'm fond of pointing out that, Harvard is saying it's guilty of
Any
systematic
police
racism.
departments that have
Maybe.
actually, or any cities or municipalities that have actively defunded their police department in a significant way to actually tell that like crime went up. Like, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, and again, I don't know, I just read the news. Like, most police departments across the board have increased their funding, or cities have increased the funding for police departments. So I'm wondering if there's even like the data available that, like, you claim that when they did defund the police, crime went up. Like, where are you finding that, I guess, is my
That's a
question.
really great question. I know that there were multi-billion-dollar cuts over multiple years, not 1 year, in Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago. But we actually sicked our research assistant on this for a little while. It turns out police budgets, like school budgets, are very non-transparent, and we have trouble comparing city by city. What we do have, at least for 1 year, is the number of officers per capita, the number of total staff per capita. There have been cutbacks. They were not huge. They were, well, in New York, the original proposed cuts in Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York were pretty large. But by large, I mean 5 to 8%. Now, add in inflation, it's bigger than that. I don't think any city has really defunded police. They have cut police. They haven't really defunded them. Last year, it's been pointed out nationally, there were increases in police budgets, but the increases were below inflation, which is a cut. So I mean, this is a really good set of questions, and I think we need more data on it. But I also think by the time we get the data, local mayors will have made their decisions based on what seems to be happening in their cities. And what's happening in their cities is initial cutbacks seem to have not brought the improvements we would have liked. Larry Krasner, the Philadelphia DA, makes an argument that we need to try massive reforming of police, so a lot of which I agree with, actually, but also including huge cutbacks and moving those resources into mental health resources. Initially, to the degree he's succeeded in that, it hasn't worked. Philadelphia's highest homicide rates in 60 years, record Black homicide rates. Actually, and I know people have been affected by that. I used to do a lot of field work in Philadelphia. Krasner argues if you give it a couple of decades, it'll work. I think that's a very callous argument. I think if people who look like Larry Krasner were getting shot, he wouldn't be taking that approach. But I mean, ultimately the voters of Philadelphia will figure this out, right? I actually favor defunding the police, just not in my city. I think this is a fascinating experiment to try, but I'm very pessimistic that it will work, including I hear things like defund police and get rid of guns. Okay, are we going to have social workers collect the guns, right? I mean, New York has pretty strong gun laws. So does Baltimore, so does Maryland, actually. The difference is New York has a police department that's able to enforce the gun laws. Baltimore police don't enforce them, right? I mean, I think that it's great to have these laws, but if you're not enforcing them, and if people don't have trust that you're going to enforce them, why? What's the point? It's virtue signaling, right? It doesn't really affect people's lives. I've had a weird caveat. This has affected my family. Back in the 1920s, the mafia, Black Hand, Sicilians call them, were moving into Baltimore, as they did in cities up and down the East Coast, and even some not on the East Coast. And they made my grandparents pay protection money. And a remarkable thing happened. Baltimore had a really out-of-the-box mayor in the 1920s named William Browning, and he had all these meetings of all the Italian-American business people in Baltimore. And he gave them all badges and guns. Back then, they didn't really train people much. He gave them badges and guns. And he said, "You're deputy sheriffs. If a mafioso tries to collect money from you, arrest them. If they resist arrest, shoot them." The mafia left Baltimore. I think sometimes you need kind of out-of-the-box leadership to establish the rule of law. Right? That's something, nobody else did that. In Baltimore, they did it. And for better or worse, Baltimore's never had much of a mafia. New York didn't do anything like that. They just improved their policing in the mid-90s. Any city could do it. We can pass the laws. We can change the procedures. We ought to be talking about that. People don't have to suffer high crime rates just because they're poor. And being poor is bad enough. Being poor and being victimized, whether it's by the police or criminals, is horrible.
So I'd like to just quickly follow up on that last point, Bob. I mean, I think one thing that's really struck me in this research is after we developed the police performance index, so drawing from civilian shooting rates and murder rates, adjusting for poverty, we saw tremendous variation across cities.
Yeah.
And when we did it a second time 5 years later, we saw very little variation across time.
Yeah.
So in terms of police performance in protecting their communities, doesn't seem to change much over time, but it changes a lot over geography. Which really does suggest that it's a function primarily of policies and practices and institutional norms within certain urban police departments that don't change easily over time.
We had a 0.8 correlation between the 2015 rank numbers and the 2020 numbers. It's a pretty high correlation.
So it's very high
correlation.
correlation.
You talk to actually cops, they sort of know this. I was talking to the number 2 guy, and my city has about 100 police. We have about 100,000 population, we're actually a little bit under policed. And I was talking to the number 2 guy in the department just about a month back, and he was saying that when he read about the George Floyd incident, he was just appalled. And he said, you know, if that officer was in Fayetteville, we would have fired him. He said, it's hard to fire a cop. It should be hard to fire a cop. We would have fired him. He said, you know, in the last 5 years, we have fired 3 or 4 cops. Actually, the numbers, we fired 4. We fired 4 cops in Fayetteville. That could be more than the whole city of Minneapolis, right? I mean, police intuitively know that, you know, some guys should not be on the force. Some guys and gals should not be in the force. That's actually a question people never ask. How many people does your police force fire? Or how many do they put in positions where they can't carry a gun, right? If the answer is 0, that's probably not good.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Regarding laws, what do you think it would take for Congress to pass legislation, being new legislation or the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act? Like, when are we gonna get, or do you think we're gonna get any legislation that would tackle police issues and police brutality?
I mean, I don't know. I thought Tim Scott had a reasonable bill a few years back, but, you know, Democrats didn't want to give Republicans a win. Now Republicans don't want to give Democrats a win. So I don't know. I think there's you could have a broad agreement on the very least that we should be counting, right? And I believe we're still not really and the Washington Post does a fairly good job, but the FBI should be counting the number of people killed by police. But also, I think the federal government should be having numbers like our police performance index and putting them out there. And I think that people should be having discussions, you know, where they're going to relocate a bit or locate a business in a city. Do we want to locate it to a city where the police are brutal and ineffective, or to a city where the police are not brutal and effective? Just as we do sometimes with schools. Government has put out the NAEP measures of education performance by state, which are actually reasonably good measures for 40 years now, for more than 40 years. I wish we would do something like that with at least larger jurisdictions with policing and make that part of the conversation. And I really should know more about federal legislation. I think Wilfred does, and I don't. Patrick, do you know?
I basically, I know a couple of the things that have been proposed. Certainly one thing that's been proposed is to remove qualified immunity from police officers. I don't think that's ever going to be enacted, because I just think you wouldn't be able to recruit anyone into the ranks if they didn't have, I mean, because they you're asking them to do a job where they might have to shoot somebody. And if they're afraid they're going to be held accountable, even if it's a justifiable shooting, then they're probably, not. So I think that's a non-starter. Some things that perhaps have a chance in like a pared down version. There could be requirements, stronger requirements for use of body cameras. There could be more restrictions on the types of, like chokeholds and things like that. That certainly could come out of the feds. And then I think the most likely policy change that might come out of the federal government regarding policing, and this is something we talk about in our paper, is a requirement that every time an officer unholsters his gun, he has to file a report with the FBI. I mean, if you had that kind of rule where a police officer knows there's a paperwork burden and an explanation required if they draw their gun, then they're not going to draw it for trivial reasons. So I think there are some possibilities for modest federal legislation, but I think the really big issues like the removing qualified immunity aren't going to happen.
And by the way, that holster thing, that comes from social science. Actual social scientists did that. So, we can play a useful role. Oh, Patrick, I am done the decision letter for revise and resubmit, and I'm hoping by the end of the day, I will have you guys a new draft and instructions. And also we have a version of this paper is under revised resubmitted journal. So. I want to thank Tinsley for great questions. And I'm sorry, I can't remember. I know you're not Oksana, but the other individual as well. And, feel free to shoot us an, actually, let me put my email in chat. And I'd be glad to send, versions of this paper. Actually, one is a working paper from last May, but I couldn't send the version under revise and resubmit now, but I could send the May version of this. Any final thoughts or questions or?
One final question from me.
Mm-hmm.
So you said that, correct me if I'm wrong, that in New York, one of the things that decreased homicides was the better police human capital hiring outside of New York.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard before that it would be better to hire police from the communities that understand the communities and understand the people that live in those communities. Do you think it would be better to do that in smaller cities and smaller neighborhoods, or would you suggest that we should hire from outside everywhere?
That's a great question. My answer is both. I think that there are definitely there is a bit of a descriptive representation literature on policing and on education too. And there is some evidence that hiring people from the community leads to modest improvements. And I think it does, but they're modest. We're talking typically 1%, 2%, 3% when you look at the regressions. Interestingly, in both policing and in teaching, but there's a problem with that, which is that it limits your talent pool, and a lot of times, great ideas might come from other places. So the tradition in New York and Philadelphia, in most cities, was that. Often it was the law, you would have to hire people who lived in the city. One problem with that was people lied about where they lived. A bigger problem was it tended to restrict the pool of who you hired to people who already had relatives on the force. And it really restricted the talent you could get. A lot of times there's great people from outside. And so I always argue for a mix of insiders and outsiders. It's very helpful to have people from inside the community. But our communities, any big city is a lot of different communities, but it's also helpful to have some outsiders who will bring a fresh perspective, who bring a different point of view, and who may just, be smarter. I mean, if you cast your net across the whole US, you're gonna get a better mix of, you're gonna have higher human capital than if you just look within Philadelphia or within Baltimore. So I really argue for a mix, and especially now it's hard to get good officers. I think we really want a mix of people in it. There's some evidence that more diverse teams do better. And part of diversity is ethnic and gender, which we look a lot at. Part of diversity is also ideological, and part of diversity is regional. Getting people from different places can be a good thing. And I think generally is a good thing. I think there's also a danger if we just say we're just going to hire from this community. Then there's the likelihood we're going to have to lower quality. And I think the paradigmatic example of that was probably in the late 80s and early 90s in Miami, where the basic intent was good. People said, oh, the department is really too white. The city's mostly Hispanic. We need to overwhelmingly hire Hispanics. And if you took away the overwhelmingly, I would be for that. Unfortunately, as bureaucracies sometimes do, they just focused on one thing. And they dropped the standards for who they were hiring. And that led to a lot of police brutality incidents and corruption incidents in the late 80s and early 90s. They eventually righted the ship. But I think that it's great to hire people from the community, but that can't be your only criteria. And I think overall, you're going to do a better job as an organization if you favor people in the community, but if you recruit very broadly. New York actually would recruit a lot of military folks. Now people would say, well, that could militarize police, and it could. Without the right training, it could militarize police. They would argue that these guys, first off, and gals, are pretty smart, pretty capable, pretty good at following orders, but also showing some initiative, and already knew a lot of the weapon stuff. What they needed to do in training was acculturate them to New York, and you would probably have them paired with lifelong New York partners, et cetera. So I would argue that, yeah, it's good to hire people from the community, but that shouldn't be just what you do. And honestly, what if your community, what if you're New Orleans? What if you're Baltimore and there are traditions of corruption and brutality in the community? You might do better by hiring a greater percentage of outsiders. Baltimore police have a bad record going back 70 years, right? When it was all white, it was a bad force. Now it's about 60% black. It's still a bad force, right? I think we probably could use an infusion of outsider blood.
Thank you.
It is actually about time. I want to thank you for asking really great questions. And like I said, feel free to email me with any follow-up things. I can send you a version of the paper. And thanks so much for having me.